the shocking case of the family that committed the worst kind of incest between parents and children, Chihuahua. For years, the high Sierra of Chihuahua harbored a secret so dark that even the wind did not want to carry it away. That forgotten corner seemed frozen in time, immune to the passing of decades, where laws, education, and even compassion seemed to have completely disappeared. It all began with a routine visit from a rural vaccination team. One of the volunteers, a young nurse from the north named Andres, deviated due to a landslide on the main road and ended up on a side path that was not on any modern map. There, unintentionally, he stumbled upon a settlement of no more than 8 houses, built from rusted sheet metal and rotting wood. The earth was barren, the silence absolute. There were no power poles, no radios could be heard, not even dogs barking, only the raw sound of the wind and a strange feeling that someone was watching them from the shadows. A girl looked at him from the doorway of one of these huts barefoot, dressed in a cloth that barely covered her body, with completely matted black hair. When he approached, she did not move. She did not recoil. She did not greet him. She just watched him with large, motionless eyes. Then, without opening her mouth much, she murmured a word that froze him. "Are you also my uncle?" It was this sentence that made him realize that something was wrong there. And it was also this sentence that led him to discover one of the most disturbing cases I remember. My name is Burgo, and this is Mexico Prohibido. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, I invite you to do so now. Here you will not find ordinary stories, but the secrets that the country has hidden underground, behind closed doors, or in the corners where no one wants to look. Subscribe and activate notifications if you dare to know what others prefer to ignore. Andres could not answer the girl. He just looked at her, his heart pounding violently. From the hut came a woman with a dry, wrinkled face, who seemed to be between 40 and 70 years old. It was impossible to determine her exact age. She told him that they did not need vaccinations or help. She asked him to leave. But before he left, Andres managed to see something through a crack in the door. An elderly man sat on a rotting mattress with an empty gaze and his pants open. Beside him, a pregnant teenager held a sleeping child who appeared to be no more than 5 years old. Andres returned to the health center, but could not get that image out of his head. He tried to report it, but neither the municipality nor the DF knew of the existence of this settlement. They told him that it was probably a closed Mennonite community or a religious group. Nobody wanted to listen to him. It was then that he sought out Clara, an older retired nurse who had worked for decades in the rural area. He told her everything. She was not so much surprised by what he said, but by the place he was talking about. She mentioned that, many years ago, she had heard rumors of a family living beyond the Cerro de las Animas, but that no official had dared to go that far. They said that there, during the time of the revolution, bandits had taken refuge, and later, a couple of cousins who had been expelled from the village by wanting to marry in secret. They went deep into the Sierra and were never heard from again. Clara felt a calling. She could not rest, so a week later, she and Andres returned to the place. But this time, they did not go as health personnel. They went as witnesses. What they found upon arrival was even more disturbing. The same houses, the same silence. But now, several people were watching them from behind dirty cloth curtains. Upon entering the community, a small child ran out, and shouted something that neither of them understood. In seconds, a woman grabbed him by the arm and told him that he should not talk to strangers. Clara approached, raised her hands in a sign of peace, and told her that she only wanted to help. The woman, with an expression between fear and resignation, told them that they did not need anyone there, that their family was complete, that everything they had built themselves, without the outside world. But before they could withdraw, another figure emerged from a nearby house. It was a tall, thin man, with an elongated face and disoriented eyes. He walked slowly, with his mouth half open and his arms hanging. He murmured words that made no sense. Behind him, a young woman, clearly pregnant, guided him with a rope tied to his wrist. Clara could not hold back her tears. What she was seeing was not just poverty or abandonment. It was something deeper. It was a community where time had frozen, where family roles were distorted, where children did not know what a school was, and many did not even know their own names. One of the girls, when asked her age, replied, "I don't know, my mom tells me that's how it was after the last big thunder." They had no papers, they could not read or write. Some could barely speak clearly, and most alarmingly, they referred to each other with total confusion. A woman said her husband was also her brother. A young man said his mother was also his grandmother, and so, piece by piece, Clara and Andres began to assemble an impossible puzzle. That night, Clara wrote everything in a notebook. She described every face, every voice, every empty gaze. Andres secretly took photographs, although many came out blurry due to the trembling of his hands. They knew they had to return with proof. They knew that this could not remain that way. But they also knew that the horror they had witnessed was barely the surface, because that community had its own rules and a buried history that had not yet fully come to light. As they left, the girl with the crucifix reappeared. This time, without saying anything, she just raised her hand and pointed to the sky. Andres asked her name. She replied softly, "We don't have names here. We are just family." And it was then that Clara understood that they were not facing a simple story of isolation. They were facing a tragedy of generations. A tragedy that began with a forbidden love and ended with a broken, self-contained, confused, and utterly abandoned family line. The worst incest is not just physical. It destroys a person's identity before they learn to speak. It confuses love with control, blood with possession. What they saw in Chihuahua was not an ordinary crime. It was a warning, and there is more to tell, for what happened in that sierra did not end with Clara's visit. In fact, it was just beginning. When Clara and Andres returned to the village, they first discreetly contacted an old acquaintance of Clara's, a retired local journalist named Don Laureano, who had for years documented cases of rural neglect, secret societies, and disappearances in forgotten areas of Mexico. After reading Clara's notebook, Don Laureano said nothing for a long time. He just smoked in silence, and finally said that he could not publish it, not for fear of reprisals, but because no one would believe it. He explained that without clear photos, without documents, without institutional support, his story would be considered a fantasy or delusion, but he warned them, if they wanted to continue investigating, they would have to do so with extreme caution. Such isolated communities are not only victims. Sometimes they are also keepers of secrets that do not want to be revealed. He thanked them for their trust, offered them coffee, and closed the notebook with trembling hands. Then Clara made a decision that would change everything. She applied for a temporary volunteer license with a civil organization that offered medical and psychological assistance in rural areas. With this support, she could return to the place with greater legitimacy without arousing suspicion. Andres, for his part, acquired a small hidden camera in a shirt button and a pocket recorder. They knew they needed more than just reports to bring to light what was really happening in that Sierra. They needed voices, and these voices, though broken and confused, could still speak. A week later, they set off again. This time they arrived with a van full of food, clothes, blankets, notebooks, pencils, and a complete first aid kit. Upon their arrival, they were received with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Some children came closer, looked at the boxes, touched the pencils as if they were magical objects. The young women, many of them pregnant, kept their distance, watching in silence. The men did not leave their houses. Clara approached with her skill, offered cookies, soap, a pen. The girl with the crucifix reappeared, this time with a slight smile that barely lasted a second. Clara stroked her hair, and when she asked her name, the girl murmured, "Sometimes they call me Maria, but not always." This phrase was repeated in other voices. No one had a fixed name. They used interchangeable, generic names. Some called themselves Mom and Dad, but also brother or grandfather, depending on the day. A woman with sunken eyes said her son was also her nephew. Another young woman with a baby in her arms claimed her little sister was also her daughter. Clara tried not to show any horror. She just nodded, listened, and made mental notes. Andres, meanwhile, tried to record everything discreetly. But what impressed him most were not the words, but the gestures, the way the children hugged each other as if they were married couples, the way the adults looked at them emotionlessly, as if they were part of the landscape. And above all, the eyes. None of them had that spark of childhood. Their eyes were dull, resigned, without horizon. One night while sleeping in the van, Clara woke up startled. She had heard a scream. When she got out, she saw a woman standing by the fire, crying. She said her son could not breathe. Clara ran, grabbed her first aid kit, and entered the hut. There, on a dirty mattress, lay a small child, no older than 5, with pale skin and blue lips. He did not respond to touch. Clara did everything she could, but it was too late. The child died in her arms. The mother did not scream, did not throw herself on the ground. She just stood there and watched in silence, as if she had experienced this before. In the corner, an older man mumbled a jumbled prayer, mixing Bible verses with phrases Clara did not understand. The most disturbing thing came after. When they asked where they would bury the child, no one knew what to say. Some said they would take him to the hollow, others that they would put him next to the others. Clara insisted on accompanying them. It was then that they discovered something terrifying. Behind one of the houses there was a ditch, covered with dry branches and stones. Upon removing them, they found remains of several bodies, all of children. There were no coffins, no crosses, no names. Only small bones, some still wrapped in rags. Clara could not take it any more. She ran out and vomited. Andres caught up with her and told her she had to leave, that she had enough, that they could not risk more. But she refused. She stated that if they left now, no one would do anything. That those lives, those deaths, would remain buried forever. She begged him to hold on a little longer, and Andres, although he was afraid, agreed to stay one more day. That day, everything changed. In the afternoon, a boy about 17 years old, tall, thin, with glassy eyes and a very soft voice, approached Clara and handed her a crumpled piece of paper. He could not read, but he said he had found it in an old box, together with a photo. Clara opened it. It was a handwritten letter with almost faded ink. It read, "If anyone finds this, let them know that we are not monsters. We were just forgotten. My parents were cousins, their parents too. No one came, no one remembered us here, and now we don't know who we are." On the back, a black and white photo showed a young couple embracing a baby. Below it, a date, 1954. This letter changed everything. Clara understood that what was happening there was not the product of malice, but of neglect, of a chain that began decades ago, with an expulsion, with social rejection, with a family that hid to survive, and with each generation the line became blurrier. Incest ceased to be a sin. It became habit, normal, necessity, because there was no one else. That night, Clara and Andres decided something unthinkable, to try to take one of the girls away from there. They did not know if they would succeed, but they knew that leaving her would be condemning her. They chose the girl with the crucifix. They called her Maria, but she herself was not sure of her name. They asked her if she wanted to see another place, learn to read, and go to school. She asked what a school was. Clara told her it was a place where children could dream. The girl did not understand, but accepted. Before leaving, they left food, medicine, blankets. They said goodbye to the few who trusted them. And that dawn, with their hearts racing, they left the community with the girl in their arms without looking back. But the road would not be easy, because there were those who did not want the girl to leave. Because in those mountains what was forbidden was not incest, but change, and they had challenged it. The girl traveled in silence, sitting in the back seat of the van, wrapped in an old blanket that Clara had brought especially for her. She did not speak, did not ask, showed neither fear nor excitement. She just looked out the window, with those large, dark eyes that did not seem to register what she saw. Andres drove with sweaty hands, looking in the rearview mirror every few seconds. Clara walked beside him, holding the backpack that contained the letter, the photo, and a handful of handwritten notes that she later intended to hand over to the competent authorities. But basically, both knew that they were not entirely sure what they were doing. They had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer simple observers, no longer witnesses. Now they had become part of the story, a story too heavy, too convoluted to carry alone. When they finally arrived at the next village, a humble settlement with a rural clinic and elementary school, they sought out an old friend of Clara's, Sister Letitia, a nun who ran a small orphanage. The nun, when she saw the girl, immediately understood that something was not normal. Not because of her clothes or her silence, but because of the way she avoided all human contact. She offered her a glass of milk and a piece of bread. The girl accepted it, but before she ate, she looked at Clara and whispered, "May I?" As if until that moment, everything had to be approved by someone else. During the following days, they tried to temporarily house her in the orphanage, but encountered the first major obstacle. She had no birth certificate, no CERP, no document. She did not exist in the eyes of the state. Clara tried to explain the situation with the greatest possible caution. but the bureaucrats turned a deaf ear. They demanded proof, forms, names. None of that existed. When they mentioned the letter, the photo, and the recordings, they were told that they could not take action based on oral accounts or testimonies without legal backing, and that, in fact, removing the minor from that community could constitute a serious offense. The threat was implicit. Andres became angry. He did not understand how it was possible to punish someone who tried to rescue a girl from neglect and at the same time protect the inaction of the authorities. Clara, with more experience, calmed him down. She told him that this was Mexico, a country where the invisible does not exist until it explodes, where the forbidden is only recognized when it becomes a scandal. She asked him to be patient, to look for another way. Then the unexpected happened. One afternoon, while the girl was drawing simple figures on a piece of paper because she could neither write nor read, but she discerned shapes, she began to hum a melody. It was an old melody, without lyrics, repetitive, with a strange rhythm. Clara asked her where she had heard it. The girl replied, "My mama used to sing it when she cried." Later, Clara repeated this melody to Letitia, who recognized certain chords and 1,000 religious songs from the 1940s that were used in processions in the North. The connection was weak, but it stirred something in the nun. She searched in old archives of the local church, and there, among yellowed documents, she found a forgotten file, that of a couple who had been excommunicated in 1953 for attempting an incestuous marriage. The names partially matched what was in the letter found by the teenager. It was a clue, and at the same time, a confirmation. The story that Clara and Andres were putting together was not entirely new. There were precedents, echoes of something that had already been warned about, but never heeded. Years of omission, decades of neglect. The news began to circulate discreetly among some people in the village. And it did not take long for it to reach the ears of those who preferred that past to remain buried. One night, Clara received an anonymous call. A deep male voice told her bluntly, "Bring the girl back. You have no idea what you are doing." Andres, when he learned of it, suggested taking the minor to another state, to try to place her in a more distant community or shelter. But Clara refused. She said that if they hid, they would lose any chance of justice. That fear should not win. That same week, a man appeared at the entrance of the shelter. He introduced himself as the girl's uncle. He had a forged document and claimed he had come to pick her up with the family's consent. But when asked for the minor's full name, he hesitated. The local police were called, but did nothing. They said they could not intervene without a court order. Clara confronted the man, looked him in the eye, and said that if he touched the girl, she would report him for kidnapping herself. The man did not answer. He just walked away, with clenched fists. After the incident, they decided to keep the girl inside the shelter, with constant surveillance. But fear had already set in. The girl slept poorly, had nightmares. She called Clara Mom and clung to her as if afraid of being returned. One day she asked if she would also have to marry in the new place. Clara froze. She did not know what to answer. She just hugged her and told her, "Here, no one will force you to do anything." The girl nodded slowly, but there was something broken in her gaze, something that neither time nor love could completely repair. Meanwhile, Andres managed to contact a lawyer specializing in children's rights. He showed her the recordings, the photos, the letter. She was shocked. She said the case was extremely serious, but if not handled with caution, they could lose everything. Her firm filed a complaint under the aspect of child protection, with a presentation focusing on the state's failures and the girl's overriding right to identity and security. They began to prepare the file, but with every step they took, they felt that something invisible was watching them. Some nights, they found the shelter's gate broken. A neighborhood dog turned up dead. Threatening messages written in charcoal were found on the walls. "Bring her back. You don't know what you're doing. Blood doesn't break." Clara no longer slept soundly. Letitia reinforced the locks. Sarah and the girl, still without a legal name, began to call herself Luz. She said she had dreamed it. That a man with a white beard had told her she was like a light in the darkness. This name, which she had chosen herself, was the one they used in the complaint, Luz, because that represented her, a ray of light in the midst of a dense fog of secrets, normalized abuses, generations marked by ignorance. A name that brought no past, but opened up a possibility. When they finally filed the complaint, it was not in Chihuahua. It was in Mexico City, with the support of a national organization. There, the documents were taken seriously. A child psychologist was commissioned. Federal intervention was requested. But the story was far from over. Because while all this was happening, deep in the Sierra, the community from which Luz had come was preparing for something. An elderly man, considered the leader of this group, gathered the adults. He told them that the girl who had been taken was special, that if she spoke, everyone would be in danger, that it was time to close ranks, that no one else should enter, and if they tried, they would not leave. And so began a new chapter, one that was no longer just about saving a girl. Now it was a battle to break the silence, to stop the cycle, and to confront those who for generations had confused family with captivity, love with possession, and blood with destiny. Luz's file was accepted by the authorities in Mexico City, and for the first time in decades, someone outside that Sierra gave a buried story a name. The name she chose became a symbol and a shield. But although the law slowly began to move, the silence in the shadows of Chihuahua grew denser. The community, that closed cluster of rotting wooden houses and empty gazes, knew it had been exposed. The girl's absence felt like an open hole, a cold air amidst the familial isolation. Some of the adults, confused and scared, began to wonder if the outside world would punish them. But the leader, the oldest of them all, repeated that he must not hesitate, because this girl knew nothing. She was contaminated, and if she came back, she would be cleansed. Meanwhile, Clara and Andres lived in the city between offices, legal meetings, and sleepless nights. The lawyer who supported them, Patricia, a resolute and silent woman, warned them that the system, however solid the case, could close like a trap if every step was not handled with caution. There were political and bureaucratic interests, and an institutional culture that preferred to look away when it came to rural areas that attracted neither voters nor cameras. But despite this, they achieved a first victory. The temporary official protection for Luz, who was entrusted to the care of the congregation run by Letitia, on the condition of undergoing a process of emotional reintegration and social adaptation. Luz began to attend basic classes with other girls in the shelter. At first, she did not speak. She sat in silence, observing everything with a mixture of wonder and detachment. But little by little she began to draw. Her first strokes were confused, concentric circles, faceless figures, inverted crosses, without understanding the meaning. Then faces appeared, that of a woman with long hair and a sad expression, that of a man with large eyes, with a rope in his hand, that of a house with a single window and no door. The assigned child psychologist, a young woman named Morella, interpreted these drawings as an expression of trauma. But what impressed her most was the way Luce referred to certain people with more than one role. She said her mother was her sister, and her father was also her grandfather. When Morella asked if she understood why that was not possible, the girl lowered her head and replied, "Because there, everyone is family." That sentence, uttered with absolute innocence, deeply affected Morella, because it was not just genetic confusion. It was the manifestation of a logic deformed by generations, where kinship was not built from healthy emotional bonds, but from blind repetition. Luce knew no other world. For her, the body was inheritance and obligation, love, a debt, obedience, a way of being accepted. In parallel, Andres decided to return to Chihuahua this time without Clara, so as not to expose her further. His plan was to gather new evidence, try to talk to someone within the community, confirm if there were more children at risk. He contacted a documentary photographer specialized in ghost towns and marginalized areas to accompany him with a more discreet camera. Together they headed towards the Sierra with updated maps, flashlights, and a disguised recorder. But upon arrival, they found a different landscape. Where before there had been dirt roads, now there were fallen trees. The houses seemed uninhabited. No voices or footsteps were heard. The place had been hidden even more, as if the earth had wanted to swallow it. But Andres knew they were there. He felt it. In the shadows behind the cracks, there were eyes watching. At one point, they heard a song, a monotonous female voice repeating a melody in a loop. It was the same one Luce had hummed weeks earlier. Andres recorded it. The photographer took some pictures, but they could not get any closer. The air was dense, and fear grew with each minute. Upon returning, Andres handed the material to Patricia, who began to draft a formal complaint for possible forced disappearance of minors, state negligence, and cover-up. But they needed something more conclusive. It was then that luck, or destiny, dealt them an unexpected blow. A civil registry worker in Chihuahua, upon hearing the case in an informal conversation, confessed that years ago she had received strange documents where several births were registered with the same parents, despite the years of difference. The signatures were identical, the names repeated. Everything indicated that someone had falsified documents within the system to maintain a structure of apparent legality. With that piece in hand, the lawyer was able to present the case before a federal court. For the first time, a judge agreed to issue an order to formally investigate the community under the supervision of the National Guard and accompanied by human rights. The operation was prepared in secret. It could not be leaked. They could not be warned, because they knew that if they were given time, they would disappear again. On the day of the operation, Clara did not sleep. Leticia lit a candle in the shelter's chapel. Luce held the wooden crucifix she had kept since they met her. Andres, from the side, watched everything in silence. He knew that this day would mark a before and an after. that it was no longer just a story. It was a battle. The caravan slowly ascended the roots of the Sierra, with disguised official vehicles, trained personnel, and a forensic doctor in case they found remains. It took them 8 hours to reach the designated point, but what they found was more devastating than they imagined. The houses were still there, but empty. Inside, dirty quilts, makeshift dolls against rags, unwashed dishes. One of the houses had strange symbols marked with charcoal on the walls. In another they found a fresh grave, newly covered, with damp children's clothes. There were no visible bodies, but the smell was unmistakable. The silence was absolute. Andres entered the hut, where he had first seen Luz. On the floor, a child's drawing, carved with stone, showed a figure at the top, with rays around it. Below, several small figures hugged each other. At the foot of the drawing, a misspelled word, Luma. It was as if someone had tried to remember or write her name, but did not remember it entirely. The operation did not find people, but it did find evidence. Remains of clothing, children's objects, a notebook with repeated names. Everything was documented. Patricia knew that this would not be enough to convict, but it would be enough to cause discomfort, to force the state to speak out, and so it was. Days later, the news began to circulate in small media outlets. There was talk of a disappeared community, of possible generational incest, of children born without records. Some radio programs addressed the issue with sensationalism. Others ignored it completely. But something changed. For the first time, eyes turned back to that Sierra. And Luz, meanwhile, learned to write her name. With crooked letters, with patience, with tears. When she succeeded, she showed it to Clara and told her, "Now they can't take it away from me, can they?" Clara hugged her. She told her no, that that name was hers, that story too, and that, although the past would haunt her, now she had something that no one else could decide for her, her voice. But the story is not over yet, because even when the truth begins to come out, the ghosts of silence continue to find ways to return. The echo of the Sierra continued to beat in Clara's chest, even kilometers away. Although they were no longer there, although the houses seemed empty and the doors closed, something of that place had remained trapped in all who had set foot there. Andres felt them in his dreams, where the nameless faces looked at him from the darkness of invented huts. Luz carried it on her skin, in the way she trembled when someone hugged her by surprise, or when she heard a door close loudly. Clara carried it on her shoulders in every page of the notebook where she had noted the details that the world seemed to want to forget. After the operation, the authorities were forced to issue a brief statement. They acknowledged the existence of a community without official records, pointed out the possibility of negligence in the rural health and education system, and promised an internal investigation. But they did not mention the word incest. They did not talk about abuse. They did not acknowledge the horror that had been repeated for generations, under their noses, among old trees and dusty roads. They only said that measures would be taken. Patricia, the lawyer, knew that this meant little or nothing, that the burden of sustaining the complaint now fell on them. They began to gather testimonies from other social workers, rural teachers, religious and doctors who, at some point, had heard similar rumors in other parts of the country. Some stories spoke of children who did not know their age. Others, of pregnant women who claimed never to have left their homes. There were patterns, There were signs, but no one had connected them until then. In the midst of that work, Luce continued her reintegration process. She began to attend weekly therapy sessions with Mirella, the psychologist. She learned new words every day. She wrote short sentences. I am Luce. Luce is here. I'm not leaving. Each one was an affirmation. An attempt to affirm her existence after having been invisible. She also began to ask questions. She wanted to know what a normal family was like. What did parents do with their children? Why did some girls have birthdays and others did not? Why, if she had been born, had no one given her a day? One afternoon during snack time, Luce asked if she could have a candle in her room. Clara asked her why, and she replied, to talk to God without him being afraid of me. That sentence disarmed everyone, because in her previous world, God had been a forbidden or manipulated name. Sometimes he was the punisher, sometimes the silent one. Never the listener. Letitia, the sister at the shelter, then began to teach her small prayers. She did not impose any doctrine. She only told her about a God who embraces, who forgives, who does not need blood or punishments to love. Luce began to sleep better. She no longer had nightmares every night. Sometimes she even laughed. One day, she drew a house with many windows. In the center, a figure with short hair, surrounded by smaller ones. They asked her who it was, and she replied, "It's me when I have a daughter, but she will have her own name. She won't use mine." Meanwhile, Patricia's legal team managed to open a formal investigation file in the prosecutor's office for crimes against children. An anthropological expert assessment was requested to understand the community's structure. A new inspection was requested with the accompaniment of international organizations. But the attacks also began. A local media outlet published a note accusing Clara and Andres of emotional manipulation and exaggeration. They said there was no clear evidence of incest, that everything was the product of a colonialist view of an alternative community. It was a disguised defense, but dangerous. The note went viral among certain circles that defended the self-determination of closed communities. Radical groups began sending aggressive messages to the shelter. Some spoke of child abduction. Others said Clara was seeking fame. Letitia received a written threat. Leave what you don't understand alone. Even Luce began to notice the nervousness in the adults. One day she asked Clara if it was a sin to have left her home. Clara took her hands and told her no, that the only bad thing was to force someone to stay where they did not want to be. To protect her, they decided to change her location. She was transferred to a safer shelter with limited access and surveillance. Mireia continued to accompany her. Clara visited her every week. Andres every now and then wrote her letters that she kept in a small cardboard box. She read those letters in silence, tracing the words with her finger, as if each line were a bridge to a different world. One day, during a session with Mireia, Luz recounted a dream. She said she had seen a woman in the forest, dressed in white, holding a lit lantern. That woman told her not to go back. That the path was long, but the light does not go out if one protects it. When Clara heard it, she knew that the girl was finding her own language. That darkness was no longer the only voice in her head. However, not everything was progress. Patricia received a disturbing notification. The community had filed a formal complaint, claiming that the girl had been kidnapped by external parties. They used lawyers, false names, documents, and regular ones. but they managed to open a process. The state now had to prove that temporary custody was legitimate and necessary. It was a new front in the battle. The judge in charge had requested a special hearing. Clara was summoned. Andres also. Luz had to testify. Although she had psychological support and legal protection, the mere act of placing her before a judicial stand was an enormous symbolic violence. Even so, they agreed, because they knew that if Luz spoke, everything could change. On the day of the hearing, the room was filled with silence. Luz entered in a white dress and the crucifix in her hand. She walked slowly without looking around. She sat in front of the microphone, and when the judge asked her if she wanted to speak, she only said, "Yes, but I don't know how." Then Clara took her hand and told her, "Just say what you feel." Luz took a deep breath, and with a hesitant voice she began to tell her story. She did not use legal terms. She did not talk about incest or abuse. She just said that where she used to live, no one had a name, that the nights were long, that sometimes there was no food, that mothers were also sisters, and that one day someone told her that she could have a different name, that she could have light. When she finished, there was such a profound silence that it seemed no one was breathing. The judge adjusted his glasses. He took notes, and before adjourning the session, he looked at Luz and said, "Thank you for your courage." Clara left the courthouse with a heavy heart. Andres's eyes were red. Patricia, for the first time, smiled. They knew that not everything was won. But they also knew that this girl had done what many adults do not dare, to name the horror without hatred, to tell her truth without resentment. But the enemy was still there, silent, hidden, and not willing to give up without a fight. Luz's testimony was not a simple judicial statement. It was a crack opened in a wall of decades of silence. The words of a girl without a name, without a birthday, without an official past, resonated beyond the court. In a few days, fragments of the case began to circulate among human rights defenders, independent journalists, and international organizations. Although most major media ignored it, there were those who decided to listen. Small news portals, investigative blogs, even universities began to request access to the file. The story that had been buried in the Sierra de Chihuahua was beginning to emerge from underground. The judge, after analyzing the documents, listening to the experts, and considering the gravity of the circumstances, issued a historic ruling. Luz would remain under protected custody, with psychological, educational, and spiritual assistance. The need to create a new identity framework for her was recognized, allowing her to legally adopt the name she had chosen. For the first time, the state recognized not only her existence, but her right to decide who she was. However, the resolution also revealed a painful truth. There were not enough guarantees to intervene directly in the community without putting potential inhabitants at risk. The access was complex, the internal structure was hermetic, and local institutions remained ambiguous and reluctant. The file would remain open, but concrete actions depended on future evidence, on other voices like Luz's, and that, for Clara, was like leaving a door ajar to the abyss. In the following months, Luz's life took slow but firm turns. She began to attend regular classes, learned to write complete sentences, to read simple stories. Mireya noticed that she no longer avoided physical contact, that she even sought hugs. Leticia integrated her into small community activities at the shelter, where Luz discovered that she could care for others without losing herself. Andres visited her every now and then, and she ran to show him her new drawings, her notebooks full of crooked letters, her paper flowers. One night, in a quiet conversation on the shelter's porch, Luz asked Clara if she could ever go back to the Sierra, not because she wanted to return, but because she was afraid of forgetting. Clara replied that memory is not erased, but transformed, that she should not carry everything she saw, but remember it, so that it does not repeat itself. Luz nodded slowly, like someone who understands something they cannot say aloud. It was then that she wrote her first complete letter. She addressed it to whoever lives there where there is no light. In it, she did not accuse, she did not complain. She just said that outside, there were other ways of living, that no one deserves to own another's body, that girls can grow up without fear. She signed with her new name, with crooked but firm letters, Luz M. Gonzalez. It was not an inherited surname. It was a new one, chosen by her, legally registered, recognized by a country that finally saw her. Meanwhile, Clara and Patricia continued to work in silence. They prepared reports, coordinated support networks, sought funding for a pilot project that would allow the detection of other communities in extreme isolation. Andres, for his part, began to write a chronicle with all the details he had recorded, without sensationalism, with respect, with truth. He knew that many did not want to read it. But he also knew that silence is another form of complicity. 1 year after her departure, Luz lit a candle in an intimate ceremony organized by the shelter. It was not a party. It was a ritual of rebirth. There, in front of a simple cross and a blank sheet of paper where she had written her story in her own words, Luz said something that Clara would never forget. I was not born when I left my mom. I was born when someone asked me my name and let me choose. That sentence was later shared on social media by a teacher who attended the event. It went viral unintentionally. Many people quoted it. Some cried. Others got angry. Some used it for political purposes. But Clara knew that that sentence belonged to no one. It belonged to Luz, and to all the girls and boys who live in corners of the country where no one's voice yet reaches. Today, Luz is 13 years old. She dreams of being a teacher. She says that she wants to return to the Sierra someday, but not to stay, only to tell stories, to tell others that there are more paths, that names can change, that blood does not decide the future. The file remains open. There are officials who prefer it to be closed. There are files that disappear. But there are also people who continue to search, to ask, to push doors. This channel is one of those doors. If this story touched you, if you felt anger, sadness, or hope, I invite you to subscribe. Not for me, for them, for those who have not yet been seen, for those who still have no name. Here in Mexico, Prohibido, we don't tell you news. We tell you truths that many prefer to ignore. Activate the bell, share this video, leave your comment. And if you believe in something beyond the visible, I ask you to pray. It doesn't matter to whom, it doesn't matter how, but now pray for the children who are still waiting to be found. Pray for the girls who never had birthdays. Pray for the broken families, and for those who are struggling to rebuild themselves. Because as long as there is someone to remember, as long as there is someone to listen, as long as there is someone to name. Darkness does not win.